Belief has so much influence on the reality we experience that I wanted to explore it in the best way that I know how. And so let's go through some of the formulas and ideas that I've outlined. So we have the I, the observer, and then we have the object that is being observed. And we have a series of filters that link these two together. Meaning, in some ways, what we are observing is not the object itself, but rather the elements of the object that are conscious when seen through the filters of the observer. One could, in fact, look at the relationship between the observed and the observer as an interference pattern. And depending on how that interference pattern is calibrated, we do or we do not observe something. If you think of a light bulb, or you think of electricity, and our eyes can't see electricity moving along, but we put a light bulb into the circle, there's resistance to the electricity, and we observe the resistance, and then we deduce, because there's no light bulb without electricity, then we inadvertently see the electricity through our belief in the electricity, through the correlation of the light, through the interference pattern of the electricity passing through the filament, or the LED, in which I'm not sure how an LED is constructed, but in an incandescent light there's a resistance, and it is the resistance that creates the friction and the heat, and we observe that resistance. But language is very much like that filament of the light. Because if we have no language, we have no consciousness. What we're conscious of, even if we say the void, we're consciousness of the domain and the meaning that the term void creates. And it's, of course, only meaningful in the English direction. If we're speaking English and only understand English, if we say habaldi, and that happens to be ancient Persian for void, it doesn't conjure the void because we don't have an interference pattern of correlation with those sounds and the meanings of those sounds. And so one of the first interference patterns that the observer, that we go through when we're observing an object, is language. And what we're doing is we're observing the object through the interference pattern of words. And so if we're observing electricity through the interference pattern of an incandescent light bulb, we're looking at this object through the lens of multiple words through which we can see the object. So, for example, if I say this is a square, and we have an interference pattern in language that says a square is a four-sided object. So we can look at it, say 1, 2, 3, 4. A square is a four-sided object. That is a square. And as a result of knowing that a square is a four-sided object, which is in a certain sense a belief in the English language, a belief in language altogether, a belief that a square exists, a belief in the idea of a side. Because if we didn't believe in a side, we could assume that these lines were rounded. And we could say there is no side. In fact, if we don't have the interference pattern of a side, then we don't have the foundation to build the number of sides upon that word. So we invent the word of a side. A side is a flat line, which is an invention. That flat line doesn't exist. It's an invention. If you look at an object, it's actually not flat. If you look at a line, you could say it's actually round. We're just not seeing the full dimensionality of it. Or we could say it's not actually a line. It's a series of erratic curves joined together in a harmony that creates the idea of a line. And then you say, well, what's an idea? And so what I'm getting at is that what turns this into something that's conscious and real and believable is a series of filters created by language, which is believed. And in that sense, if language is not believed, and thus it is not taught because it is not believed, therefore it doesn't exist because it's not believed, so it's not taught, then the question is, to what degree can we think and be conscious? And what do we call the kind of consciousness that is not linguistically based? Because I'm not seeing this interaction directly. I'm rather having a sense of the geometry of the interference pattern created by hundreds of thousands of correlations next to words, which are all based on an ecological relationship to one another, meaning language is an ecology. And it's not a perfect ecology. There are elements in the linguistic equation that don't quite add up. So there's an element of tradition that smooths it together and makes it seem coherent. But really, it only exists to a certain extent in relationship to itself. So you have this ecology called language, which creates an ecology called consciousness, which creates an ecology called thoughts, which are part of language. Thoughts exist within the ecology of language because thoughts exist within the interference pattern called a thought. So language is a filter, an interference pattern, like a filament between me, the observer, and the object. Now, within the domain of language, we have correlations between sensory patterns, which sensory patterns also exist within the framework of language, because we don't know what a sensory pattern is unless we understand language. We know that pattern is a repetition, and we know that sensory refers to 5 senses. And we know what those are. We locate the 5 senses by saying this is touch, this is sight, smell, taste. So we're locating and we're saying, okay, I can distinguish this pattern of observing from this pattern and from this pattern. Yeah, that's the sensory paradigm of sound. And then, now that wasn't a sight, that was a sound, or that was what the sound object looked like. The vibrating violin string makes that sound. And so there's this fascinating emergence of interrelationships called language. And it's interesting that we can call a language because how can we see language outside of the paradigm of language? Like, what do we have other than words to go outside and look at the distinction between what are words and what are not words? because we're looking through the lens of the consciousness creating words. We don't have to speak the words, but we have to think the words. And so if we think, close all our senses and say, how does this square exist if I don't have the language to say square? Well, how does it exist? Do I have any distinctions to make a difference between this and this and this and this? Because what makes this different? Meaning, in ecological awareness, there's an argument to be made that every single thing that has ever existed or ever will exist is interrelated, and that the entire equation collapses if any one part is removed. Well, that's of course a sophisticated filter of language, but if we look at language through that filter and look at consciousness through that filter, who's to say that this square exists? Maybe what exists is a soup of probable perceptions. Maybe if the word square doesn't exist, or if the word flat doesn't exist, and if the word white doesn't exist, and if the word color doesn't exist, and thus the thought of color and the thought of shape doesn't exist, what exists? And how can you relate to it? Maybe if you don't see square, an object, what if the word object doesn't exist? Well, then you might have a thing, something that's called this bit of the whole, or this whole. In fact, if you have no distinctions through language, you have this whole. And if you don't even say this whole, you could just say this, and there's no difference between this, and this, and this. It's all this. And so it's obviously not terribly useful for navigating around, but if you're not identifying as a self or as a body, it may not be particularly useful to be alive and thus discern that we need to breathe this and eat this and do this. That there's just this. And so how do we relate to this? And of course, we have instinctual drives. You know, a tiger may not say this is a square, but has some kind of an algorithmic program to say every time I see that shape, someone in the family dies, or there's something that makes me nervous, so the best way to respond is this and this and this. It's not through language, but there is a relationship, and so you can see there's a pattern of survival. But that's just what we call it. It could be a pattern of 10,000 other things that, if we looked at another angle, we would see that. It could be a pattern of complexity, for example, rather than a pattern of survival. It's not about survival of the fittest. It's about movement towards complexity. But what if we didn't have a word for complexity? You know, and we had a word for survival, or we didn't have a word for survival, we had a word for complexity. And so reality is constantly shifting based on the thoughts that we think, which are themselves a product of language. So we then observe. What do we observe? We observe distinctions through the lens of language. And we first distinguish between the fact that this is an I and that this is an object. And then with that distinction, we look at however many distinctions we can create in order to observe this. And we can observe it at simple or at complex levels. For example, if we observe it through the lens of inches, we'd have to get a tape measure out, and we could say this is 3 by 3. And that's what we could be observing. Or we could be observing that it's white. or we could observe that it's white and black, or we could observe the curvature, or we could observe color density, like that's supposed to be an underline, but if we're not understanding that that's an underline because we're not looking at those words, we might be looking simply through the lens of the fact that it's stronger here and it's fading out, and we could observe this whole object through the lens of fading in density. Or we could observe this object through the lens of thickening and thinning. It's very thin here. Or we could observe the object through the lens of jutting points. Meaning we might have been raised in a culture where we don't see anything other than, for some reason, it's very important to us, for some reason, to notice what juts out around other things. And so we don't actually say this is a square. We say this has 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 jutting points. And it could be that we distinguish a jutting point that's 10% versus 50%, and that it, for some reason, at 75% jutting point, this is a momentous event and it means something. So we say no meaningful jutting points. And then the other person on the other side of the phone says, that means something because they're in a framework in which that's what's being observed and measured. I see a shape. How many jutting points? Any significant jutting points? Yes, there is. There are no significant jutting points. Okay, on to the next thing. Where someone else could be saying what's the shape? And this is it takes consciousness in a completely different way. And then you say, well, it's a square. And then you say, why? Well, it has these things called sides. Well, what's a side? It's the external approximation of the outer boundary. As defined by what? As defined by, if it was real, we could touch it, because this is actually not even a cube. This is an approximation, a symbol through which we're imagining a cube. I can't actually feel it, but we're pretending. And so where did that come up? This idea of approximating things and being able to write with them. And so this relationship between consciousness and what is observed in language is very, very thick, because we're still in the English language to say how far it's jutting out. But what about all the words that haven't been invented? Like, I'm trying to think what word could be used around this that we don't use. Because we have a word called jutting. We don't pay any attention to things like that. We just say, oh, that's a sloppy square, because we never pay any attention to jutting out lines. But what if that was the alphabet of a language where how far the line jutted out meant everything? Where they basically have squares, and that would be one letter, that would be another letter, this would be another letter, that would mean another letter, and they'd be really fine-tuned to calculate exactly how far these were, even when they weren't spelled out, and that the entire alphabet was different versions of the square all next to each other at different intensities and stuff. And so that's their whole alphabet. And their entire framework of thought is measured by the distance of these jutting points. And so in that case, it would be very useful to train the eye to notice how far it jutted out, and were all the juts in horizontal, were they all to the right, to the left? And that would be very, very, very interesting to do. Or another culture may say it's a cube, that's all there is, but it's a cube over a certain bit of the color wheel. And this bit of, if you took the color wheel, if the cube was here, it means that. Then the next letter is there, and that means that. And it's all the exact same square, but it's a square that marks a certain amount of color, and that the gradients of color in different relationships through the lens of the square would actually represent every word in the English language, and just be a masterful representation, of course. the reason we wouldn't have such a culture is we had bits of nails and wood and stuff to make lines in rock long before we had 256 million colors on a computer and color wheels to move squares around. That wasn't as practical given our ecology. But then again, on a planet where there were literally billions of color disks all over the place and lots of different size squares, they might just as well have done their representative technology by laying squares over colored disks. And the history of usefulness would determine the level of trained eye, just like a violinist can tell, that's a world-class violinist. They play a note and they say, oh, that's off a bit. We hear it and it's like, is that off? I don't know. I don't know how to read music. And so we're not attuned to that. So we attune our consciousness to observe what's useful, and that's through the lens of language. And also shared use. Speaking Latin is no longer particularly useful since nobody understands what it is. English is much more useful, so we'll be tuned in to notice a variety of things in English. And now that we've gotten social media, we're getting very well attuned to things like tone, where you'll have YouTube commentators take 60 seconds of someone speaking and then talk about that 60 seconds for 10 minutes and the nuance here and the raised eyebrow, because we have a technology that can debate something, whereas if video didn't exist, that technology would not be terribly useful because you wouldn't be there to see the patterns like, oh yes, there did. I just watched Trevor Noah, poke some fun at Trump for not knowing the national anthem and mumbling it along with his voice. But you have to zoom in on his mouth to realize he doesn't know it. He's just saying a few of the key words and then he's, humming along and not knowing the national anthem. And, and that becomes interesting as part of a pattern of disregard for, learning basic fundamentals around the country, as the president of the country. And so when you can zoom in and see this and little eyebrows and voices and realize, then it becomes very interesting to have those distinctions. If video doesn't exist, you can't do that. So it's not terribly useful. People would just make up their own version rather than actually say, yeah, it's true. He's singing less than a third of the time, but pretending to, and you can see it if you zoom in. So we have language, we have observation. We have observation, which is curated through value. And value correlates to our human needs. Now, the human needs are, just what we've called them, but Abraham Maslow makes a fairly decent case for saying that we all try to survive, and having satisfied that, try to be secure in our survival, and then seek love and belonging, and then seek self-esteem in a hierarchy, meaning that most people, if given the choice to die or seek self-esteem, will tend towards seeking to live rather than feel better about themselves, i.e. run out of the way from a forest fire rather than focus on their meditation, is a hierarchy of values. Even those values exist within the framework of language and within the framework of culture. And so we have a lot of kind of difference in how this object emerges and presents itself based on the filter of language. We also have this awareness, and this mental shortcut that when we can create and see a pattern, because one of the values of a belief, and that's what we're kind of exploring, is the relationship between the observer and the object through the interference pattern of belief. And what's true is that if you can predict the future through what you observe, your survival goes up as a general rule. Meaning if you're trying to commit suicide and you don't understand how to pull a trigger of a gun, you may fail committing suicide because you don't know how to align yourself with the gun. If you don't have any idea of how to relate to reality, then you may want to die and not know how to do it, in which case you start fiddling around and figuring it out. But pattern recognition enhances success. And I guess in the case of suicide, success is feeling better by destroying the mental, emotional, physical matrix that is making us feel so miserable. Most people don't commit suicide because they're feeling great. They commit suicide because they feel bad and do not anticipate feeling better, which is a belief. And so then, in that case, having decided and observed that they are in pain and anticipated that it will continue or get worse, and thus their success is committing suicide, then if they can recognize a pattern, it will help them achieve their goal. And so what we develop as observing and measuring technology and emphasize tends to be correlated around this belief and experience that our well-being is enhanced to the degree that we can accurately predict the future based on the experience that or based on our behavior. Because we have a certain amount of behavior, and most of us have some ability to act. And if we understand the consequences of our actions, we will tend to use that knowledge to increase our well-being. Overall, it can get cloudy, as in someone who believes their survival will go up socially if they have a horror story. So you might create a horror story so that you can tell the horror story and achieve social ranking, since we're very interested in disasters. So if you wanted to be the center of attention, all you'd have to do is be raped 3 times that day, and suddenly, I was raped 3 times today. People will have more time for that than they will saying everything's fine. And so, there's subtle dances in these domains of what will and will not create the best flow and response. But the reality is, through all the nooks and crannies, that if we can predict the future as a result of recognizing a pattern and hopefully remembering the pattern, looking through our observing and measuring devices, our reality will go up. When I think it was the Rockefellers were making a lot of their money, put a lot of emphasis on getting the news about the war a few seconds, a few minutes before everyone else, so that they could make decisions based on that news. And obviously, if stocks are going to rise precipitously or plunge precipitously, and you know 5 minutes, 10 minutes, an hour, a day before everyone else, then you're going to make more money. If you understand that the left road or the left queue in the shopping center, you're in a queue, and one's going to get there 10 minutes faster, and then you're going to be able to get the real deals, in a limited supply because you're in the first queue and the other person isn't, then you're going to get the real deal. And if you understand that if you hire this person, your company is going to go up in value, and if you hire this person, it's going to be sabotaged, well, then you hire the person where the value goes up and your success increases. And so what we're looking at is observation and then a system of pattern recognition that is designed to create a more successful relationship with the future. That's what it's all about. I look out, I see a square object. It's shaped in something I have called a truck. It is moving in a way that I call momentum. It is in an angle that I call towards me. And because I know all of that, and because I know large masses of things called trucks, when they hit bodies like me, kills the body, I jump out of the way or wave to the drivers to make sure that he sees me. And again, if I believe that the driver is wanting to keep me alive, then when I wave at him, that's going to help because he'll stop or move the truck away. Or if I believe that he's trying to save me and I wave, but he's actually trying to kill me, I've got to be able to ascertain from their response. Do they see me, and are they speeding up and steering towards me now that they see me, or are they stopping the truck? Obviously, the belief that they're trying to save me needs to rapidly shift to they're trying to kill me if the truck speeds up and turns towards me. And if that belief allows me to leap out of the road in time, thus my body is staying alive, then I've developed a relationship with the future that has benefited me. So we could say that all perception, all belief, all language, all observing and measuring devices has one primary aim: to increase my well-being. And since we observe that we are empathically connected to those we love, and we observe that through that empathic connection, I feel sad if those that I love are being slaughtered, and I feel happy if those that I love are smiling, we can also then say that part of that selfishness naturally extends to become selflessness as I seek well-being for all those around me, if nothing else, because it's fun to be around happy people. And so you have these models of reality, and to the degree that they correlate with experiences of well-being and success, then those are useful and valuable models, and we will keep to them. And the models of perceiving and anticipating the future that correlate to increased suffering and pain will be used less and less. And if I say, I have a vision, and my vision of reality is this, and because I had a vision, meaning I had an imagination, I'm going to do this and this and this. If most of the time I have a vision, things, and I act on it, all hell breaks through. And if most of the time when I get out my calculator, things go well, then if I'm intelligent and I care about myself, I'm going to ignore my visions more, and I will pay more attention to the calculator. What is a calculator? It's just a word that means a machine that helps me predict numbers, meaning that's the whole point of calculators. If you say 3,297,000 plus 8 minus 2,301,000, if the calculator predicts is the best way to predict an accurate outcome consistently, that calculator becomes incredibly valuable. If the calculator just spins out nonsense, we obviously have no use for it. So we have language, we have observation of a pattern through the lens of language, meaning if you don't have a word for color, or let's say there is a color, let's say there's a color called umpten, but the human eye can't see it. So we don't bother using the word, and we don't have any glasses that see umpten either. And there's nothing particularly unique about umpten. So it just stays as a dormant color, meaning it's there, but we don't pay attention to it, and it doesn't help us succeed. But let's say umpten is only visible in things that have cancer. And let's say there are a pair of glasses you can put on that let you see umpten. Then, rather than having to go to the doctor and this, that, and the other, you might have a very valuable ritual that there's a set of glasses in every house that see the color umpten, and every month everyone is looked at through those glasses so that immediate steps can be taken, like, oop, there's 2% cancer, we can get right on it. Well, then suddenly umpten would be an incredibly useful color because it's allowing us to take action on something we can't currently take action on in any other way. That's allowing us to predict the future and thus take actions to create a better future. And this is would become an incredibly useful thing. When we look at things like the ability to see an atom, because then it allows us to create nuclear power, well, that becomes very interesting. And then creating something like the CERN Hadron Collider becomes very important. But if you can't predict something in the future and you can't do anything with that, then why are we spending all this money to do that, even though it exists? If umpten doesn't correlate with anything, then why are we all buying special glasses to see it when there's plenty of other nice colors to see? And umpten is no different from any of them. So we're looking at patterns, and these patterns stabilize over time. Meaning when 99% of the time when I put my hand towards something like this, it stops right at the point where I see this shadow and this image merging, well, then it's useful to have what's called a belief that that will happen. So a belief is an efficiency vehicle. The belief is saying, because if you don't believe it and you just observe it, then it's not a pattern in your mind. It may be a pattern, but if I don't see the pattern, then it's a mystery. It's very exciting. It's like, what will happen this time? Oh my goodness. I wonder if that'll happen the next time. Whoa, it's still happening. I wonder if it'll happen the next time. Still happening, but I have to keep moving to see what will happen. But if I create a belief that says every single time I push my finger in this context, there will be a pressure. And so I don't need to push my finger to see what will happen. I already know what will happen. If I create a belief that says, anytime a substance looks like this, and I know this is a blackboard because it's got this edge and it's got bits of chalk, and that's what it was called, and blackboards, nobody would sell a semi-permanent permeable blackboard. So this is definitely a hard surface just because of the name. Well, that's very, very useful. It saves me years of research discovering what happens when I press the blackboard. And so it's a useful heuristic tool to anticipate reality, and based on that anticipation, make effective assumptions that do not require regular verification. Now, a blackboard is pretty trustworthy. I've never found a blackboard that suddenly penetrates my finger. And so the usefulness of beliefs are in part determined by how stable reality is, how stable the object is. So a blackboard never becomes permeable. That's not absolutely true, because let's say the blackboard was made of some material and an acid contacted it. Or let's say it was a 1 in a billion or a 1 in a trillion phenomena where it was permeable. Well, the amount of energy it would take to touch this a trillion times to find that the one time it wasn't permeable would be so inefficient relative to the amount of success that I could create by just assuming that this is the way it was, that it's more useful to base this on a belief. So even though it's not true, it's true to such an extent that there's more harm in testing for anomalies than there is assuming it's true. It'd be similar to if you have a goal of going around the world and you don't believe that your feet are solid, well then maybe every time you take a step you have to test the step carefully. And to test the step carefully, you've got to slow down walking. And to slow down walking, you can't get around the world in a whole lifetime. But if you can run and take boats and believe that they'll work for you, even though they don't always, then you'll be around the world in 3 months or a year. And so you'll achieve your goal. And so it's not that every belief is 100% certain. With a lot of beliefs, they are probability fields. And so you believe them because it's a decent thing to believe based on what is most efficient to predict. And there's sometimes you don't. Meaning, even though most snakes won't kill you, and most snakes won't bite you, and most snakes aren't poisonous, it's not a good idea to believe that snakes are harmless. It's more helpful to believe that they might be harmful. Because if you ask the question every single time, rather than dying, well, dying is a pretty final outcome. But on the other hand, if you just believe that the floor, if you believe that the floor is likely to be solid, well, they're not always. Floors are not always solid. And there could be all kinds of things going on that you're not aware of, rotting under thing. But if you believe that floors are solid, and they are 99% of the time, and the few times they're not going to kill you for the most part, then believing that they're solid will allow you to put your creative mind on something more efficient and more relevant. And of course, people are the most complex people of all because they change. And they change unpredictably. And they have different facets, and they respond differently in different environments. And so one of the kind of explorations of belief that I want to explore is the metaphysical idea that belief creates reality. And I was watching the biography of Eddie Izzard, one of the British comedians I enjoy, and he decided at a young age that he was going to be a comedian and an actor. And he, based on that, he started copying the Monty Python and his idols, of the time, and doing the things he saw them doing. And he failed. He failed for years. He believed that he was going to be a comedian. Now he looked out at the object. Now a comedian is someone who makes people laugh. He looked out at the audience and they were not laughing. They weren't interested. They weren't paying him a lot of money. And so the question is, how do you deal with that pattern for years at a time? Well, he believed that he would be in the future. And so based on that, he continued to experience ongoing and sustained amount of pain, improving every year, building this skill, building this skill, building this skill. And over time, the only mask that he was encountering was the fact he didn't know how to control an audience. He didn't know how to appear confident even when he was terrified. He didn't know how to time things right. He didn't know quite what the line was. He didn't quite understand what comedy was. But all of that is learnable with experience. And so, and he also didn't know what the audience would laugh at. But he believed that if he kept doing it, that he would be able to learn those things. And what he's learning is attunement in his own psyche and his own body. And so plenty of people told him he was crap. Plenty of people told him it wasn't a good job for him. But he believed, and he became one of the great comedians of our time. Robin Williams paid him high tribute. A lot of intelligent people enjoy Eddie. And so in this case, the belief, seeing something, and working with all the obstacles. The obstacles, for example, starting with someone like Eddie, is he may need 1,000 hours in front of an audience before he reaches the 50% mark. And then he may need another 500 hours in front of an audience before he hits his stride. So if he believes and desires that reality in that domain, then he can work through the 1,500 hours of mass that he's going to encounter on the way to that reality that he sees. But it's an important thing to understand the mass that you're dealing with. Because in this case, let's say it's a mass of 1,500 hours. Well, if you believe that you're going to be a great comedian and you believe that the mass is 20 hours, well, that's an unsustainable belief after 20 hours and you're still crap. If you believe that if you keep at it, you will be a great comedian sometime before you die, and the actual mass you're going to have to go through is 1,500 hours, and you want to be a great comedian, and you're willing to suffer for 1,500 hours, then that belief is a tool for success. There may be other beliefs, like I could be this instead, if the language existed, if the culture existed, if that pleased you. So there is a phenomena where if you believe something and the reality is such, that the belief can create the reality. There's also the belief that allows you to see reality as it is. So there's two kinds of tools that you can work with belief. One is to generate a reality, meaning when Eddie believed he would be and could be a great comedian, that's a generating tool. I mean, if he believes he is great even when everyone's booing him, then that's a bit crazy making. But if he believes he will be, and thus and he believes in practice, and practice is a pretty good pattern, meaning most people throughout history, if they practice something for 1,500 hours, get better at it. Most people do. So if you believe that and you practice for 1,500 hours, odds are you'll succeed at getting better. Will you be better, good enough to be on a world stage, traveling, booking 30,000 people for a comedy show? Unlikely, but possible. There's a probability field, and you get closer to that probability field with belief. 4 years ago, when I first developed PTSD and could no longer write and read clearly, I believed that if I made coherent videos every day, that after a while I would have something meaningful to contribute. I believed that because I believe in the protocol of articulation, and I believe in practice. And I observed the trend from writing to video. And so I believe something good would come of it. And so I'm a good 1,500 hours in to making video. And I still believe that because I've watched steady incremental value. Some of those videos left me completely wiped out. Some of them left me feeling incredibly stressed emotionally, etc. But that belief kind of worked slowly through that process. And so that's a useful belief if the goal is to end up being able to articulate difficult things. That was one of my goals. To take people into inner parts of my reality that I couldn't speak about and thus be more visible in those domains. That was another goal. To speak on behalf of other people in that same terrain. That was another goal. And to get good or better in incremental ways in front of a camera. And to do so in a way that was not a burden. Meaning, sure, I could have a camera crew here and zoom in and stuff. And I couldn't afford 1,500 hours of practice with a camera crew. And so that wouldn't be a sustainable belief. I could, I'd get through an hour and I'd be, it's like, there's the $1,000. And it's like, I can't just do that for another, I don't have a 1.5 million to do that. But, a single camera, adequate microphone, that's doable. And so this equation of mass and momentum versus belief is an important one as it relates to the idea that you create your reality with your beliefs. Because there's two levels of that. If I believe this is a square, based on the reality that most of the time I see a shape like this, I can anticipate that if this were a cube, it would not roll. For example, square things, I've never seen square things roll, unless you're knocking them over. So it would be useful if I wanted to say, like, would this be a good stop under my truck tire? Because truck tires are round, so they roll. Well, square and stuff doesn't roll, so would that be useful? And I think it would be useful to anticipate that. If I believe that this square will make me lots of money, is that a useful belief? I don't think so, because I have no idea how that could be the case. And I do have the idea if I say that signing up another contracting job would make me money, because that makes tons of money. And so in that framework, to perceive a reality and then predict outcome based on accurate perception of what is, that's one really great way of using belief. But to generate a reality that doesn't exist, you want to get a sense of your momentum or the mass that you're overcoming. Let's take another example from Eddie, who did an amazing marathon around the United Kingdom to raise money for charity. And he believed he could do 30 marathons in a row, running 30 miles a day on average. So we're talking about, over 1,000 miles run in a very short period of time. And he was 48 years old, minimal running thing. Now, he went and talked with Olympic trainers and this and that, and there was a documentary about it. And it was viewed as very unlikely. But Eddie's pretty stubborn, and so he felt he could do it. And he felt that he would do it if the film camera was on him, because he needs approval. And so he boosted the odds in that way. And so understanding just how hard that was and setting himself up for a success, having a masseuse, having the right food, having film crew, having people help pace him, being trained, the right diet, and the whole thing, and he succeeded. He ran as a non-marathoner with little running experience. He ran through the entire United Kingdom, Ireland, Scotland, England, and Wales. I mean, that's pretty impressive. And so, understanding how much mass he was dealing with, and calculating a weight, like if he'd raised that for the same amount of time and said, well, I can believe I can do 2,000 miles, he would not have succeeded. The 1,100 miles or so was really close in terms of what he could do in that amount of time. And so the goal or the distance is the mass that you're dealing with. The belief in the future determines how much mass is between you and the belief. If you as a 100-pound untrained woman believe that you will win a 300-pound heavyweight trained male boxer, you have to look at the odds of that. Is it 1,000,000 to 1, 1,000 to 1, 30,000 to 1? What are the exact odds? And so there's a relationship with mass. Now, some things are, of course, a little bit more fluid. And this gets into that domain of metaphysics where, to what extent can chance or uncommon probability emerge into the terrain? Because you have something like a vision. If you're a writer, if you're like J.K. Rowling, who went from poverty to billionaire with the Harry Potter series. Of course, if she hadn't believed in them, she wouldn't have kept being rejected and keep up the show. If Larry Page and Sergey Brin didn't believe in Google, they wouldn't have kept making the rounds of venture capitalists being rejected. Meaning Google was rejected, just like J.K. Rowling was rejected, a large number of times before they found someone who would take that on. And so we're dealing with an issue of belief. How much do you believe it? How much do you see it? And is that enough belief? And do you value it enough? Because you could say, I'm absolutely certain I could run that marathon, but I don't want to. So then that's an unlikely, you don't want to start a marathon when you don't want to. And it's already unlikely that you could do it. But if you really want to, and you see there's a 5%, 10% chance that you could finish it, then that's a reasonable belief to have. So it's about the mass and the probability field and the motivation. And, if you're someone like Elon Musk, when he started SpaceX, he expected to fail. He thought there was a 10% chance he could succeed, but that it would be worth spending 100 or so million of his own money, even go bankrupt, to make the attempt. And so it wasn't a belief in success, it was a belief in its importance. And so we can see that we can work with belief and reality in a variety of different ways. And as we do work with belief and substance in a variety, and probability in a variety of different ways, there's a couple of questions. Does our pattern of observing and interacting with reality through belief, pattern, observation, and language, does it lead us towards a successful relationship with the future? Successful just means it's the relationship we wanted to have. Does it lead towards integrity or integration? And that's a subcategory of that because, for example, if I want to believe that this is the one time a square is going to roll, why am I making that story up when the data says that every single time I've had a square object, it hasn't rolled? But I'm going to believe this one rolls. Why? That weakens the integrity of the data. I can have wishful thinking, but if I call it a belief rather than wishful thinking, I'm likely just to confuse myself rather than integrate with the existing data. Does it lead towards meeting my needs? Is my pattern of engaging with the future likely to increase my ability to meet my needs, physically, emotionally, mentally, financially? Does it increase sustainability? Well, that's a useful subcategory around success because, for example, if I'm doing a job that's meeting my needs, but I'm not sleeping for 36 hours and I'm just believing I'm going to keep staying up for months, the body doesn't do that, but it's also not sustainable. It damages the health in the long term more than taking rests. Does the belief or this relationship algorithm between observer and object, deepen our awareness? Does it make the relationship with the object more conscious, which usually correlates to success? Particularly, does it add complexity and distinction? For example, saying the bus will be here is not as useful as saying the bus will be here at 10:59 on Monday, and it will arrive at this point. You've now added the complexity of the dimension of time, which dramatically increases the odds you'll catch the bus. Does it help us predict the future? Now, these are probability fields, meaning there is nothing that is certain. But if you go to Vegas and the house wins 60% of the time, 99% of the time, if you place 100 bets in Vegas, you're going to walk out of there poorer. Now, it's not to say that that's guaranteed. It's just to say that if you want to be richer, don't go to Vegas and place 100 bets using the normal odds. If you've got some gimmick or this and that, fine. But the belief is valuable if it helps you predict the future the majority of the time. And that's all you're looking for, is a majority. Now, a simple 60-50 or 60-40 majority can work if the cost-benefit thing is not too high, meaning if the cost is not too high. If 40% of the time you die and 60% of the time you make $1, you can't bet 60-40 odds. You'll be dead in a few bets. But if the odds are 1 in a million you die, and every time you win, it's $1,000, then if 60% of the time you win $1,000 and 40% of the time you get one count towards that million statistic, well, then that's a good game to play. There's a couple of equations up here. Belief plus action equals reality. And that's in the framework of generation. When, Eddie believes he can be a great comedian, he's in fact a shit comedian, but 1,500 hours later, that belief is starting to manifest. That's belief plus action equals reality. You also have belief plus data equals belief. So when I say, that's a good man over there, I know he'd never betray me. And then I see him sleeping with my wife, belief plus data equals new belief. So I had the belief, I get new data, and the data either confirms the belief, the working assumption, or shifts and shatters that belief. How can I believe this is someone who would never betray me when I'm seeing him having sex with my wife? Data plus data plus data equals belief. And this is when beliefs are forming, we look for regular patterns. Children are doing this all the time. But what it's all about is accurately and repeatedly predicting the future. And anything that lets you do that the majority of the time, when the risk and cost and risk are somewhat equal, is a healthy investment, particularly when you consider the fact that pain usually adds to awareness. The brain dwells on pain and learns from it. So you do something and it works and you do it again. You do something and it's painful and you really think about it to figure out what you'll do differently before you do that again. So does it help us predict the future? We want to understand that language isn't perfect. that we are never seeing the fullness of the object, that thinking is very limited, meaning there are universes of thought that we don't know because we don't know them. And we don't have language for them, and we don't have paradigms through which to develop those thoughts. As a result, we don't see a lot of reality. And even 50% of the reality that we do see is tuned out. And there are patterns within patterns. So the day trader trades the stock up and down during the day. The week trader goes up and down during the week. The quarterly trader goes up and down on the quarter based on daily cycles, quarterly cycles, weekly cycles. But there are also 100-year cycles. There are also, Ray Dalio does a good job of presenting the long-term debt cycle as being a really important predictor for the entire rise and depression of different economies. And then beliefs start out crude and get more sophisticated. People are good. People are bad. Not a very useful belief. This person is good in this situation and bad in that situation 89% of the time. That's a good belief. It's not necessarily a good belief to bet your life on, but it's a good belief to invest some money in. Because if someone in this situation is right 89% of the time and the return is good, well, you can put $10 on that, and 89% of the time that'll turn into a 20. Take half out of the picture, stay in the game since you've got that loss factor, and place another bet, and diversify. That's a good model. So belief creates reality when there is a strong desire and willingness to work towards the reality, and when that goal is within the realm of a mass that is mutable. Eddie Izzard could have believed that his wife would become a comedian, but if his wife didn't want to become a comedian and didn't practice 1,500 hours, believing that his wife would become a comedian would be a waste of, it's not an intelligent belief. But believing that he could, and knowing that he would and did put in the hours, and understanding, he's not setting himself the challenge to run to Mars and back. That belief would be absurd. You can't run for one, so we don't have any, so that's absurd in this framework. But run around the United Kingdom, breaking it into 30-mile marathons, pushing it, but probable with his level of stubbornness. So that concludes this exploration of belief. It's been fun, and I know I've learned a lot thinking around these domains. I know there's more to explore, but that gives me a more conscious model and some thoughts on how to go about succeeding in this domain.